How's it going, guys? It's Cass. It's been a few days since the patch notes and still a few days before League started, so I thought I'd take some time to talk about the nerfs to Poisonous Concoction and Poisonous Concoction of Bouncing, and on top of that, give you some numbers that I put together to give you a better understanding of what these nerfs actually mean. Here's just going to be a quick refresher on how Poisonous Concoction works. So the first thing that you have is the flat added chaos damage. That's the first line on the skill. Then we'll skip down to the very bottom of this skill. Added chaos damage equal to, in my case, 14% of flask recovery amounts if charges were consumed from a life flask. So basically what this means is a divine life flask with no mods recovers 2400 life. What it will do is it'll take 14% of that 2400 and give you that as added flat damage as long as you have flash charges to consume. Now that number can be increased, in this case to 3600, but it can go all the way up to around like 5300 with a high quality life flask and a max roll on increased amounts recovered. So what this means is instead of having 2400 life recovery, that it is taking the 14% flat damage, it is now taking that out of 3600. So why am I talking about this? In the actual patch notes, what's happened with Poisonous Concoction and Poisonous Concoction of Bouncing is the flat added chaos damage on the skill was nerfed from around 20 to 25% at all gem levels. And what they've done to offset that is they've increased the percentage of flash recovery rates that gets turned into added chaos damage. Now, what I'm assuming they did with these nerfs is they looked at Explosive Concoction, where a majority of the players using Explosive Concoction as a leveling skill were not using Flask to give extra benefits, and decided that's probably not something that makes sense thematically for the skill, and nerfed the flat damage and slightly increased the buff from using a Flask and using flash charges. Now, with Poisonous Concoction, however, almost every single build, aside from maybe Elementalist builds, were using Life Flask to get the increased added damage from the Flask recovery rates. That's because it's simply a very large amount to just skip out on. On top of that, a majority of these builds were also investing a ton into Flash Charge Sustain, so basically 100% of the time, or like 95% of the time, every single Poisonous Concoction that is used is being modified by both portions of the added flat damage. So the question then becomes, if you decrease one and increase the other, what is actually happening here? So I did go through and do some small calculations to think about what the actual reductions are. So what I did is I started with a flat 2400 Divine Life Flask with no mods, and then calculated the difference between pre and post nerfs. And we can see here a 10% reduction on the low end and a 20% reduction on the high end of flat added damage. I did the exact same for a 5000 recovery life flask, which at this point is around the top. If you get a perfect one, it's like 5300 recovery rates, but overall 5000 is probably as good as most people will get endgame. And in that case, it's a 2% reduction on the low end and a 12% reduction on the high end. So when we average the two out, you can see it's a 15% reduction at with no extra recovery rates on a Divine Life Flask, and a 7% reduction as you get to the highest level of recovery rates a Divine Life Flask can have. So basically what this means is in that early mid-game, early endgame situation, or late mid-game, early endgame mapping situation, right as your gems get to level 20, and right as your flask are probably higher than 2400 recovery rates, but still not at that cap of like 5000, you're going to feel the most from these nerfs. Now, a 15% reduction to flat is definitely substantial, but it's not something that you're going to feel consistently. It's more or less going to be an anecdotal thing as you're playing. And I think that's going to feel pretty similar for leveling at level 1 or at gem level 1 with a level 12 life flask It's around a 12% reduction. Something interesting to point out is that the way the percent of the flash recovery rates taken as added chaos damage is calculated is not linear. So there's some situations like when your skill gem goes from level 2 to level 3, where you still have 6% of the flash recovery rates as added chaos damage. So what this means is in these situations when you're going from gem level 2 to gem level 3, is you will feel the reduction in added chaos damage, but you won't get any benefit from the actual buffs to flat percent chaos damage from these level windows. Now, honestly, are you going to feel this? Probably not, unless you've leveled Poisonous Concoction a lot. And even for those that have done it a lot of it's probably just going to be placebo. Overall, I don't think this change is that impactful. The biggest impact will probably be felt to classes that aren't Pathfinder, but I still think something like Slayer is probably a better option for the first few days of the league, and then potentially moving into a different build from that point. Overall, Poisonous Concoction and Poisonous Concoction at Bouncing have really always been builds that are like week 1, week 2 builds, and then you move into something else. If you want to, you can spend the time to overinvest into these builds, but realistically, going from a point of the build being like very good to the best is something that takes a ton of currency that doesn't really make sense in a lot of situations. You know, what makes Slayer good is the early game defenses that you get. You get endurance charges easily, you get leech easily. Those are both two things that Pathfinder does not have. Now, with the changes to the meta shifting more towards block, it is a lot easier to get access to block. Well, both Pathfinder and Duelist, or both Pathfinder and Slayer, have the same access to block. But for Pathfinder, having block as an extra defensive layer is nice. Now, for the most part, though, the amount of investment on the tree to get to that amount of block chance is still a pretty big cost early until you get to things like Svalin. Obviously, once you have Svalin, then Pathfinder is going to be significantly better, but last league, Svalin was like 80 to 100 divines in the first week, and if you're spending that much on Poisonous Concoction, it could be spent elsewhere to have a build with better clear and better damage overall. I still think Poisonous Concoction still has its place in the meta, however, it does feel like it's more of a build that you use as a way to get to a better endgame option, which, as I said before, it honestly has always been that. Overall, I think you can still play this skill. My Slayer build from last league as a league starter will still be perfectly fine for those that want to play it, but for me, I'm going to be playing something different this league. Most likely some form of melee build, maybe like Fortify stacking champion with Bone Shatter. I'm still kind of like fleshing out the details. I've done a couple practice runs, and leveling with Sunder feels incredible on champion right now. So I think that's probably the route I'm going to go. If that build's good, I'll make a video for it. But that is pretty much it. Hopefully you guys have a good league start. Hopefully this video helped to actually see some numbers and get a better understanding if you were considering starting Poisonous Concoction. Thanks for watching, and if you liked the video, leave a like.